welcome everyone. We are back with APIM Hotrod. Hello, Stefan. How are you?
Hey, Massimo, fine and you?
Very good. It's episode 14
Already.
time. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's sometimes pass from the first episode, and I love it. It's nice. It's nice.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
today we will talk about reusability. So how we can reuse artifacts within our Azure API Management instance. It's in your wonderful maps. That is your map is our Polar Star. You have a section about reusability.
mhm,
And today we will use, let me bring a little bit some material to help the discussion, right?
yeah, indeed.
Okay, so let
It's
me
nice.
to try to move to the next one. You
Yeah.
will have to tell us something about reusability, Stefan?
Yes, so basically, as we see on the slides, indeed, we have 5 scopes, right, in API. So for policy and mostly reusability in APIM is we'll see around policies, right? Because with policies, we can control a bit of everything and enforce some controls. And so we have different scopes, as highlighted in the squares, right? So you have all rectangles here. You have like the global scope, workspace, product, API, and operation. So, and of course, it means that you can apply policies to all scopes at once, to different levels. It all depends on your use case, but of course, that means that you will have to probably apply or reapply some policies multiple times. Hence, the reason why you should try to make them reusable. And so, and basically for this, but I think it's in the next slide. I'm not sure, Massimo, but for this we have something called policy snippets, which actually help you basically reuse or policy fragments, which are policy snippets, basically that you can reuse from one policy to another,
Yeah.
and of course to apply that to different scopes.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
in general, also, let's say here, those scopes, what is the power of that scope that you
yeah,
put your part of your policy into a scope, and
yeah,
then that, let's say, part of the policy that can be one or multiple fragments, we will go to the fragment,
yeah,
that that part will be again applied in a consistent way, right? So the
yeah,
usability is baked into that layering that the engine
yeah. Yeah,
provides.
that indeed. So of course, policies have had the scopes as we see here. So you start from global workspace products. So these are also levels of inheritance. So meaning that if you, for instance, create a policy at global scope, by default, all the other levels will inherit from that policy, so the policy would be enforced, unless, of course, you would decide otherwise. But if you see here, and that's visible in the schema here, you have like, I know it's not actually, you don't see the base, but anyway, if you have by default, let's say when you define a policy, all the sub levels are inherit from that policy, and that's typically enforced by something a statement, the base statement that will say, okay, please apply the scope of my parent. So every scope has a parent except global, of course, which represents the entire instance. So somehow by default, indeed, independently of whether you use or not policy fragments, policies somehow are reusable because they are applied across multiple scopes, um, unless you decide otherwise. And of course, the lower scope is the operation. So if you have an API with 3 operations, for instance, you could decide to have one operation with a specific behavior, and that the policy would only be applied here. But that, of course, depends on the use case you want to enforce.
Yeah. And here in these slides, there is one nice tip from that is coming from a friend of us. In this case, is Stone that brought up to us this I think nice tip that I mean, especially in a situation where in scenarios where you want to apply some um, controls in a consistent way, like in this example you see at global there is log. Suppose that you have log or you have some security policies or fragments that must be applied in a consistent way. If you don't use the base word, you might be in the policy that you apply to a new API. It might be that then you will not be able to enforce that control, that
Yeah,
security control.
yeah, you break basically the inheritance. But indeed, but the thing, of course, sometimes it can be tricky because you might need really some specific behavior. So, like, For instance, say that you would enforce GWAT validation, because that's a typical policy, right? That you validate that the consumer is providing a token before going further. Remember in one of the previous episodes, well, I think in the previous episode, Massimo, we were talking about the health probes, right? So if you want to expose a health check endpoint, for instance, through APIM, then of course you cannot enforce your validation there, because typically health probe do not have this do not have the ability to request an access token before probing you. You see, plus it would be also counter-performant because they would need to request a token over and over again. And so in that case, you have to break the inheritance if you are at the scope, like an API operation, for instance, that is lower than, of course, the parent. You see, because if you then keep the base statement, then the product level policy like shield validation would apply. In that case, you don't want this behavior, right? Or you need to have a separate API that would do some aggregation, aggregated monitoring whatsoever. But you see, so there are situations in which the base statement, it's legitimate, let's say, to remove the base statement, but then it's of course harder to verify this. I mean, in an automated way. But then, of course, it does not prevent you from still re-implement some part of the parent. You see, the part that you can afford. You see what I mean? So say that in the parent
Yeah,
level you have
I
GWAT and you have
understand.
something else. Maybe the log. You see, take your example. You might say you remove the base, you do what you need for your specific behavior, and you still re-implement the log. You see,
Yeah.
but indeed, it's
Of
harder
course,
to check. Of course,
it depends, and the tool give us
yeah,
the
flexibility.
possibility to
Yeah,
manage the same, to I mean, to give different solutions
yeah,
to the same problem, let's say,
yeah.
and uh, it might make sense for a company. It might be used to enforce a security, or might be used just to enforce maybe that example of security doesn't fit the company A, but fits the company B. It
Yeah,
really depends on the case. In general,
yeah.
limiting or having a quality check is a good practice, but of course,
Indeed.
yeah, to see
Uh,
how
yeah,
much restrictive and what is the case
yeah.
of the use case of your company, right?
Indeed, actually not having the base statement is the exception. So then indeed, if you validate if the base statement is there or not, if it's not, then you might ask the project team or whoever is actually implementing it to say, okay, but why did you remove the base? So is that, well, was it intended? You see, because indeed, if you remove this, then you break the inheritance, so everything that is enforced at parent level will not be anymore.
Yeah, to me, it
Yeah,
all depends on how much you are trying to industrialize the process, and
yeah,
and normally you need more strict release procedures when you are having a bigger company and multiple, let's say, departments or multiple teams leveraging the same, let's say, gateway in this case.
mhm,
So then you need more strict things. But
yeah,
of course, at the end, it depends. But it might be a good tip
yeah.
regarding policies and
Indeed,
reusability.
indeed.
What I will move to the next one, Stefan,
Yeah,
that you were mentioning this fragment. So people can a little bit visualize
yeah.
this fragment and how can be reused, because years ago fragments were not there. So if you want to reuse something, you need to hack it, or you need
Copy
to.
paste somehow, yeah. Or I mean, if I will have it in different files, but yeah, yeah, was indeed not reusable. So I actually spoiled it
Oh, no
almost
problem.
immediately. But indeed, so policy fragments are a way, of course, that's as indicated on the slide. It's a reusable snippet. And so indeed, that makes it more efficient instead of repeating over and over again the same fragments in the end. So before, when fragments did not exist, but you had the entire blocks that you had to repeat from scope to scope, let's say, and from policy to policy. Here you can reuse them, so that makes it more efficient, let's say. And of course, the whole goal is that if at some point you change something, so maybe a good example is indeed by the required claim stuff, as you see here on screen. If at some point you need to add an extra required claim for, you know, for your APIs, then instead of changing that in every API, say that you would have not an all API scope, but API per API, let's say maybe half of your APIs must have this, then you actually change it one place and then it applies to all. So that's the, of course, advantage. So from a maintainability perspective, this is easier to manage it this way. Yeah. Um,
There is one thing that maybe I will write because I will write live because maybe it's not readable. When because it comes here to my just in my mind while I was looking at this slide. So when in order to include a fragment
yeah,
into a policy, you have this include fragment
yeah,
equal, and then you put the
the
fragment
name.
name.
Yeah,
That's how it works. And one of because it came to my mind because of what you were saying. So
mhm,
suppose that you have this fragment that is called JWT validation,
yeah,
and you said we are going to add, for example, a new claim,
mhm,
and
mhm,
one of the best practices is just always to version these fragments.
mhm, mhm,
So
mhm.
sometimes by name to, of course, you have all of your version in your
Yeah,
Git repository, but it might
mhm,
be a very good tips to call it, to give it version, I don't know, 1, and then version 2, etc., etc.
mhm,
Then you don't get lost
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
with the values if you add something more. So
mm,
it might be a
yeah.
good one.
Yeah, but it also depends on how you want. Yeah, indeed. But I would say it also depends on how you want to. So how you want it to propagate or not. You see what I mean? So because
Yes,
as you
exactly.
yeah, so that's indeed a way to decide. Okay, if you want, you say no, I want any way to enforce that everywhere. You might say okay, you stick to version one, for instance, if you already have version one, indeed, and then it propagates against all the references, let's say. And if it at some point you would need indeed to have side by side, let's say two different fragments side by side because maybe you still want to preserve an older behavior, then indeed you could have a new version. I mean, same way as API versions in the end.
Yeah, exactly. If you
Um,
want to create not, and here another things that unfortunately is not implemented, but I believe that everyone would love to have is this kind of
yeah,
notation, right? Where you could say,
yeah,
unfortunately, you can say, mm, I want to use or inject this jot
parameters.
validation,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
there is no possibility to send, like, for example, an array of
yeah, yeah.
claims. So
Yeah,
let's say,
that would actually be policy functions somehow, right? If we could do that, it would be like it would be similar to functions a bit. But
yeah,
indeed, that would be great. That is maybe indeed food for thought for Microsoft to try to
to get this one.
to get this done. But anyway, fragments are already an improvement compared to before. So yeah,
There
so
is
that's a
another
way. Yeah.
there is another things that or two things that comes to my mind about fragment. Okay,
Mm,
one very obvious that note here about improved readability. So it's good for reusing,
mhm,
and then is awesome for improving readability. Like
yeah.
if you ever saw in the past huge policies
Mhm,
whether you are where you are asking, okay, man, let me try to understand how the flow is controlled, or how
yeah,
the
yeah,
mapping is done in case or whatever, or how security is done. All in one, it's a hell. Huh?
it's a hell. Yeah, no, indeed.
The readability with snippets is awesome.
Indeed.
That's
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the second thing that I found still tricky
yeah.
as a lessons learned. So if you have like like this example here, so the fragment per se contains something that is called jot variable.
Yeah.
One, sorry, audience one and
Yeah.
audience two.
Yeah.
So because you cannot pass these things as a parameter,
Mm.
every time that you want to use a fragment, you have to go into the source code of the fragment and see whether this fragment is, let's say, independent
Yeah.
or rely on parameters that you have to set
Yeah.
to extract certain variables that you have to set up before. Like the example here, maybe it's very small, but
Yeah.
this fragment relies on four variables.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to do the four times set variables before calling the snippet. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
always have
Which
to
is
go and
indeed,
check, go and check, go and check.
no, indeed, indeed, and also something because you mentioned huge policies, so that's indeed also make me think about the fact that you should try to avoid anyway huge policies by default, but especially not include
I
any
see.
business, let's say, logic into the policies, right? So in general, so whether whether you use fragments or not, and that's something to because anyway that would probably anyway uh, be harmful for reusability, but also because whatever the policy engine can do, it's definitely not .NET or Java. You see, I mean, it will still be
Yeah,
limited,
it's
right?
fun.
So yeah, tell me.
Sorry, I jump you because I think there were a little accidental mistake in your wording. You said you should avoid policies. I think you meant you should avoid big policies.
Big policies, yeah. I thought I said huge policies, but okay, maybe
Oh,
I
maybe so.
skipped the word. No, it's maybe me. Anyway, it's good so that at least it's clear. No, of course, you should always use policies for sure, right? Otherwise, your APIM, I would not say it's useless, but it's a real path through. But yeah, you should avoid huge policies or big policies. And more importantly, you should avoid putting a business logic inside those policies, whether or not you use policy fragments, that should be avoided at all costs. And if it becomes too complex, you can always offload this complexity to a purpose-built backend, right?
Yeah,
That you would
exactly.
call from a policy. Yeah,
Good, 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 good. Let's, I would say, let's move on with
yeah,
another trick about reusability trick. In this case, it's not a trick; it's a very
no,
common thing. So, what about
yeah.
name values?
Indeed. Yeah, yeah. So named values. So basically, you reuse them. So as we see on in the example here, so named values, you put them between brackets, and then basically it needs, of course, to exist as part of named values, which are key value pairs, which can store plain text, secrets, and actually key vault secrets. So that's not only reusable, but that's also a best practice in terms of where you store, let's say, secret data. And so APIM has a native integration with Key Vault, and then you can say, okay, that named value is holding a secret that is baked by a Key Vault. And so that's more secure on top of being more reusable. And so, and again, so here as well, reusability. Why is that more reusable? Is because, of course, if the value changes for whatever reason, you change it in one location, and then all the reference to that value will be updated as well, right? So instead of going through all the policies where this value was used and then update them all at once,
Yeah,
one
it's
after
easy
the other.
for configuration management
Yeah,
using, let's say, native objects in
yeah,
API management. So it's all about also, as you were saying, keep the things clean, right? And
yeah, indeed. Just cleaner,
manageable.
and safer, more manageable, and also more secure, at least if you
Yeah,
use secrets with Key Vault.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that means also that the actual values, if you, for instance, you would use Key Vault, then are not stored in the policy code, right? So even not in the CI/CD, for instance. So then it makes it
I think,
hard. Yeah,
but
yeah,
I have to check. There is only one caveat that if you are using the trace,
yeah.
let's say
Trace
policy,
policy.
there is a trace that you can analyze the log
Yeah,
of the policy
yeah,
engine.
yeah,
You
yeah,
might
yeah.
have this secret in the trace if you
No, no, that I think it's shown. Yeah, indeed. So if let's say there is a policy involving a named value and you use the OC, the API trace header, right? That's what you mean.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
you
yeah.
debug. Let's say, yeah, I think it's yeah,
I think it
yeah.
will be in the
Actually, yeah,
plaintext, but I will check. But
I'm not
it's just
sure.
like
Yeah, I
it's
think you will get the
important.
plain
It's
text indeed.
it's very useful, and thanks God there is this tracing
Yeah,
mechanism.
yeah,
Otherwise, it would be pretty sometimes difficult to understand what happened in the policy engine and the performances of the policy engine.
yeah,
However, sometimes if you deal with secret as usual, you should keep. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
careful
yeah.
with
I'm not sure that obfuscated. No, actually, you made me doubt about it, but yeah. I mean, anyway, double check it.
yeah, exactly. Okay.
So that's the yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
another things that also in the context of reusability might be a reusability of our infrastructure as code or our the way that we deploy, let's say, an API or something else in the API management instance, right?
yeah, indeed. I mean, infrastructure as code is reusability by definition. So indeed, of course, if you use an APIM instance, and actually even there, you could use modules across APIM instances, of course. And then, of course, a good way to promote reusability is by working with bicep modules, but you could, of course, Terraform, whatever, let's say, a technology you use, but then indeed verify those modules as explained here. And yeah, and you can reuse that. And of course, especially it's also shown here, if you have a flat visualization, we tackled that aspect in one of the first episodes, then it's an easy scenario somehow, which then it makes it very easy to reuse the exact same modules, because it's not that you have a lot of variance from one
Yeah.
APIM instance to another.
And I think that it was actually yesterday or the day before I was talking with some other, let's say customer or expert or technical guy in the fields,
Mhm,
where he was explaining me that in their setup they were, let's say, using API management as the design, then they were exporting the things, etc., etc.
mhm,
But if you have this compound or aggregation or filtering of operations, it's one thing. But when you have a pass-through API, there is nothing else. I mean, you take your open API specification and just you put it into the
yeah,
gateway, and you only change, I don't know, the path, or
yeah,
you change the backend ID and all of these kind
yeah,
of things.
yeah,
It's super easy to use always the same release pipeline for every pipeline or an instance of
mhm,
your data for every release that you have. You just pass the Open API
yeah.
and file, and then it's completely done.
Probably what you referred to as the customer was explaining was they are maybe probably doing API ops, right, with the DevOps toolkit, extracting stuff from one instance and then pushing that. Yeah, it's actually not that straightforward to use, to be honest, that one. But indeed, you see as well this approach being used on the field as well.
But it's the
Anyway,
most complex, I believe,
yeah,
Stefan,
for me,
because you
yeah,
need
I agree.
maturity and discipline.
Yeah.
And the problem of the API ops, which I like it as a principle, the problem is when you need to deviate from that one. Then you have
Mhm.
to take that principle, the code of that principle, and then do all of your customization. So, and then you are deviating from a standard approach with your approach, and then you have to maintain those deviations.
Uh,
Um,
it's not an easy one for sure. But anyway, today we have plenty of choices, which was not the case before, right? When it comes to deploy APIs and policies and so on. So Bicep is there, Terraform is there, and of course this API ops involving the DevOps toolkit is there as well. Yeah, these are the three. But I think, to be honest, today I see mostly Terraform or
yeah.
Bicep.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, then there are other kind of, we mentioned reusability, like backend, loggers, schemas. That's
yeah,
all again similar to name values as a
yeah,
principle, is to
yeah,
keep those native objects
yeah.
to keep to manageable the
Yeah.
overall
Yeah, it's basically
overall.
centralized artifacts that you reuse across policies that are
Exactly.
themselves distributed. That's a bit how
Exactly.
to see this. Yeah,
Okay, so
well,
I would say that for today we are at the end of our episode. So if you are looking this episode, I want to thank you for joining our channel, and
yeah,
please reuse those artifacts. Make your solution easy to maintain, secure, and modular.
yeah,
It for my side.
yeah. That's it too. And you said it all, Massimo. So I think, well, looking forward to the next episode.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you,
You
everyone.
see you.